7 new cards to review this time, including the Rogue Legendary Minion and some ridiculously strong class cards.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
If you just want to see the reveals, hit the quick reviews link in the description to jump right into the 5-star ratings. Otherwise, let's jump into the detailed reviews. Okay, up first here is Anka the Buried, new Rogue Legendary Minion, a 5-mana 5/5 with a battle cry that reads, change each Death Rattle minion in your hand into a 1/1 that costs 1. So a bit of a familiar effect here for Rogue, but operating in a little bit of a different direction. So the idea here is you get a bunch of Death Rattles in your hand, hopefully some big scary stuff. You drop Unka onto the board, and suddenly all of those Death Rattles are really cheap. And hopefully most of their value is actually behind the initial minion in the Death Rattle effect. Think cards like Mechanical Whelp, where you don't really care about the 2/2, but the 7/7's pretty insane. And then you essentially on a future turn, maybe even in the same turn, drop a bunch of Death Rattles that make it very difficult for your opponent to deal with everything, because as soon as they chip through the first half of those Death Rattles, they have some big scary stuff staring them down. And that's the idea. Now, the question has to be, will that idea work? I think it could. I mean, certainly if you get, a couple Mechanical Whelps, a handful of other big Death Rattles, and you dropped those all on the board at the same time, most opponents and decks would have difficulty dealing with that. Cards like Earthquake could certainly help. Maybe some Warpaths, depending on the size of the minions, certainly not with Mechanical Whelps. But it's a neat idea in that you could build this one really resilient, sticky board that somehow helps you win the game. The challenge, well, actually, there's a few challenges. The first challenge is that because they are 1-mana 1/1s, your opponent doesn't necessarily have to react right away or react to all of them simultaneously. They could maybe just chip away at one, deal with that, and then leave you with just some 1/1s on board that aren't necessarily inherently threatening, because they're always just going to be 1/1. So the first halves are rather weak. And that means you'd have to activate them yourself, run some other synergies, so it requires more than just one piece of this puzzle to kind of solve how to make that board impactful. Another challenge for this card is that you have to have Death Rattle minions in your hand, which means somehow you're accruing cards without playing them. So you have to have either a lot of card draw or just a really, slow deck that isn't doing much while you build up cards in your hand. How many cards you need to make this exciting is a question I don't have the answer to. Maybe just 3 or 4 Mechanical Whelp style things would be enough. Maybe you need 8. Maybe 2 is enough. Maybe 2 Mechanical Whelps and you play them on turn 7 is a really exciting play. I don't think so. I think there's probably a magic number somewhere around 4, 5, 6 where it feels really good, which means you're running a ton of Death Rattle cards in your deck suddenly. And the turn you're playing Anka the Buried herself, she's not all that strong, just a 5-mana 5/5, not doing a lot immediately. So do you play her on turn 7 or 8 to play some Death Rattles immediately? Perhaps you do, so it's an even slower play. So the more I line this up, the harder and harder it feels to get off a good turn here where you're doing something really exciting. Now, there might be some combo potentials out there that I haven't thought through just yet. I did just think of one card you could combo with it, I guess, which is Mecha'thun, kind of the obvious choice. 1-mana Mecha'thun is intriguing, certainly, because it makes it easy to kill it, and that's a possibility for a combo, but I still don't think that's good enough. You got to have the Mecha'thun in hand. You got to draw through your deck. There's still a lot of challenges. Myra's Mecha'thun, backstab stuff could happen, but if your Mecha'thun's not in hand, you got to wait for all of that to unfold. You're still spending a lot of mana on Anka. It still seems like a tough thing to pull off to me, but it's at least one idea that might work for this card. Let's take a look at Tip the Scales, a new Paladin spell at 8 mana, and it reads, summon 7 Murlocs from your deck. So, great name, first off. Hilarious name, and a pretty big effect, right? Full instant board of stuff in Hearthstone, as we've seen in the past, can often be really good. And in fact, with the current set of Murlocs, could just be a lot of raw damage output. If you hit like double Bluegill Warrior and a couple Grimscales and a Murloc War Leader, you're looking at a fair bit of damage output here, while also building a fairly monumental board. The challenge for that, I suppose, is that traditionally when this happens, you're not going to have a lot of health on board. You're not doing things like playing your Cold Light Seer and really buffing up your Murlocs. You're not giving them any resiliency with like Soul of the Murloc like we see in Murloc Shaman. So it is kind of an all-in, like, go for it kind of plan, particularly because you're also just you're just making your deck tiny because you pulled 7 cards out of it as well. So it's not like you could do this forever, right? But it's still a big enough play that it might be worth it anyway. If you're playing an aggressive Murloc-based Paladin deck of some sort, or you can rely on other tools to generate some assets, then this could just be that like final push that you need, the final punch, the final straw that your opponent can't deal with. It reminds me a little bit of a card like Forest Aid right now, where you just get this big board of stuff and hope that it's enough. But much like Forest Aid, it has a backup plan, right? The twin spell aspect, the second Forest Aid. So again, you're kind of all in with Tip the Scales, and it has to be enough to get you there, or you're probably going to lose the game after this point. Beyond that, it is an 8-mana spell, so can an aggressively minded Paladin deck run a card like this successfully, playing towards turn 8? Because, you know, if they're hitting their power around turn 3, turn 4 with Murlocs, there's a pretty big gap to turn 8. You got to do something in the meantime. So you might say, well, okay, maybe I'll build like a mid-range deck that just has a handful of Murlocs in it. But then you realize, well, you got to have way more than 7 Murlocs if you want Tip the Scales to work, because you're going to draw some Murlocs naturally, right? You can't only put 7 in there. You might need like 10, 12, 14 Murlocs. And at that point, your whole deck is Murlocs, Spill Moles, you know, at least half already. And then you might as well lean into Murlocs even harder just to maintain the game plan. So there are some deck building challenges and restrictions with this card to make sure that you have the right set of Murlocs, and you're able to build a deck that supports a Murloc game plan while still supporting Tip the Scales. And that's feeling like a pretty big hurdle to overcome for me. I know that this card itself looks good at first glance, like, whoa, so many Murlocs. But when I figure out how to get to this card and how to build your deck to support this card, that's giving me problems. That's a headache. Now, there are some other cool applications of this, just like thinning out your deck of stuff to help you find bigger things, but that's usually less valuable the later in the game you get. And you're just sitting on an 8-mana spell that's dead in your hand often. That's another problem for an aggro deck, by the way. So I want to like this. I want to think there's some OTK setup that's guaranteed, but drawing cards makes something like this rather weak, because it just gets worse every time you draw a Bluegill Warrior. You know, you lose your charge damage. You're like, ugh. Maybe in Wild there's some other ways to use this that's even crazier, because there are more Murlocs and more charge Murlocs available. But in Standard, I'm just coming up with more headaches than solutions when I look at this card, and I don't think it does enough. I don't think it plays towards its game plan well enough, and that means it's probably going to fall short. So moving on here to the Fishflinger, and my apologies for the low quality artwork here. This is a new 2-mana 3/2 neutral Murloc with Battle Cry. Add a random Murloc to each player's hand. So just a nice little Murloc body in a Murloc deck, 2-mana 3/2, an aggressively minded, fairly statted 2-drop that also helps you find more resources to continue applying pressure and keeping the Murloc game plan going, at the cost of also giving your opponent a Murloc. Now, most of the time, giving your opponent a Murloc is not a big deal, because they're not going to have the synergies necessary, or potentially even the deck necessary to utilize it successfully. But do keep in mind things just like Nightmare Amalgam, for instance, could be a pretty big backfire, where they just get a nicely statted minion to play on turn 3 to take some trades into your Murlocs that they might not otherwise have had. And generally, they're going to get a cheap Murloc because there aren't any expensive ones, which means they're going to get at least something to throw into the board to potentially just chip away at your stuff. So there are some meaningful downsides here. If a deck didn't have a play, this gives them an out. It gives them a play to at least do something, just generally a worse play than what you're going to get. So would a card like this be running like Murloc Shaman, for instance, these days? I don't really think so, to be honest with you. They have so many other ways to make stuff that making stuff with a downside isn't necessary for them. Like, this will come off Underbelly Anglers, certainly in the pool, and chain into even more stuff for them, which is cool. But I don't think it's a card they actually run in their deck list. I think this one probably gets left at the wayside for better options, but you're not necessarily upset to see it when it comes out of an Underbelly Angler, for instance. So a cool card to exist in a lot of ways, but maybe not one that is viable in standard format necessarily as we see it today. Now, outside of Murloc Shaman, would other decks care more about this resource generation for a Murloc game plan? Potentially, it's something that could help the previous card we saw, like bridge that gap to turn 8 so they have enough stuff to play in the meantime. But at the end of the day, I still just think there are going to be better options for 2-drops in general, better options for mill decks, better options for Murloc decks. So across the board, this one looks fine, but not exciting. Bloodsworn Mercenary is a new 3-drop for Warrior. Comes in at 3/3 with a battle cry. Choose a damaged friendly minion and summon a copy of it. So this is a pretty standard stat line we see at the 3-mana minion slot for 3/3. We know that's a reliable, playable stat line, and the battle cry here is something that offers a ton of upside because you could summon pretty much something of any size as long as you set up a scenario for it. So I think most likely these days you'd expect to summon things like some mechs in the late game. Maybe you've magnetized a couple mechs, you've stuck a Beryllium Nullifier onto something, you've traded it in, and then Bloodsworn Mercenary is there to make you another second giant mech. That feels like a completely possible play if this comes down in the late game. If this comes down on curve, I think it's far less likely to hit something good. I mean, theoretically, you could have a 2-mana minion or maybe a lingering Eternium Rover, and this could copy that, and it might still be worth it, to be frank. Like, a 3/3 alone we know is reasonable, and if you just get like a 1/2 or even a 1/1 Eternium Rover, that's enough of a total stat line to make this feel like a solid play, especially with a card like Eternium Rover, where there's actually some additional upside bundled into that as well. So when I look at this from both an early game standpoint on curve, it's an okay card, and then I look at it at a late game standpoint, it seems like a very powerful card that could do all kinds of crazy stuff. And I like cards that have that dual flexibility. That means decks are more willing to run them because they're not dead draws in the late game. Now, specifically with mech, the one deck that I reference here, I do wonder if this will make the cut. It just has to beat other things. It's got to be better than like Clockwork Goblins, for instance. So it's not a mech itself. So there's some challenges to put this in specific decks. But if you take that same logic and you apply it to anything else, just a mid-range deck that has rush minions that like taking trades, this can summon you an extra body. If you put it in a control deck, they still run some big threats in the late game traditionally. Maybe you get like a Ysera down that sticks, and you can make a second Ysera. Whether you do it in a deck that you see today, or you just imagine decks that could always exist and have historically existed in Hearthstone, I still see some ways to play this thing. And just summoning copies of stuff is really good with such a flexible mana cost because those copies retain their stats. So unlike cards in the past that have summoned like 1/1 copies of stuff, this has a lot more potential upside. And as we know, Warrior doesn't have difficulty damaging things either. So if you think that's a conditional aspect that's hard to achieve, I disagree with that. We've got rush minions, we've got whirlwind effects. This is gonna be able to activate pretty consistently. So every direction I try to break this card down, it looks like it's doing something pretty solid, and I can certainly imagine this finding its way into some decks because it looks rather strong. Moving on here to the Hunter's Pack, a new Hunter spell, 3 mana. You add a random Hunter Beast, a secret, and a weapon to your hand. And I'm pretty sure I've seen like this exact card either on like the custom cards subreddit or maybe submitted to my own custom card reviews. Very, very familiar design, just of course with some cool new artwork, which is great if people are designing cards that end up showing in the game in one way or another, whether it's the exact same or just really close. That's a good sign that custom cards are on the right track from time to time. But anyway, I think this is a really cool little spell for Hunter, and again, seems kind of powerful. You get you get 3 things here for a 3-mana spell. So it's kind of like drawing 3 cards. It feels like a rather efficient tool. The problem is those things aren't controlled. You don't know what they're going to be, so they're not as good as cards in your deck, but that can actually be advantageous sometimes too. And I went through and I looked at all these different pools for hunters. So secrets, hunter, beasts, and weapons. And right now, there really aren't any major backfires. I wouldn't consider anything you get a big time failure. I think the like Worst case scenario for a beast is maybe a starving buzzard. And that's kind of it. All the other beasts look like things that had some utility. Certainly some are higher cost than others. So depending on the state of the game you're in, you might be sad to see a low cost beast like a Timberwolf, but it's still a really good card, and Springpaw is a really good card. I think Starving Buzzard was just the only kind of bad card in the pool, and even that might be a suitable tool in the late game if you get it. So Hunter Beasts work. Secrets, we know pretty much every secret has some degree of playability. Again, obviously some are worse in certain scenarios, which is the downside with random stuff, but still good cards on average. And then weapons right now, there's only a few in standard. That can always change. But all the weapons are fine too. I mean, Gladiator's Longbow isn't a card we see played much, but probably something you'd be rather happy to see added to your hand randomly. So what that means is you're probably going to get at least 2 out of 3 cards you're excited about, and it's unlikely that any of them are just like terrible, unplayable garbage. Like, it's going to be stuff that you're willing to use. So a pretty handy little resource generator for Hunter. Also, it can catch your opponent off guard because they suddenly don't know what you're dealing with. So there's a surprise advantage to a card like this. The only question for this card is, do you run this over other stuff? Hunter has to have a consistent curve and a nice little tempo of things. Hunter's Pack maybe doesn't fit in all that well. Master's Call right now serves as a nice card draw utility for Hunter because they know what they're getting and they know that it fits their game plan perfectly. This maybe fits a little less than perfectly. It's not drawing, it's just generating, and it doesn't interact with Dire Frenzy like Master's Call in particular. So you might think, well, this isn't quite as good to make the cut. And you might be right for now, but that may not always be the case, depending on what Hunter decks exist out there. For instance, this has some really cool interactions with Zul'jin. Not only does Zul'jin add you 3 more random cool things, thereby extending the total amount of resources available, but you also get that extra secret again, too. So if, you know, there's some kind of spell-based Hunter deck, or maybe a little bit more of a value or control Hunter deck in the future, a card like this could certainly help empower that rather nicely. Again, it just looks like a pretty powerful and cool card. So speaking of powerful and cool cards here, we have the Evil Recruiter for Warlock, a new 3-mana 3/3. Again, stat line that we know is rather suitable. And a battle cry that reads, destroy a friendly lackey to summon a 5/5 demon. So that's right, if this works out correctly, you are going to get a 3-mana 8/8. And the 4-mana 7/7 memes may finally die because 3 mana and 8/8 of stats is far, far more scary. And I think even the fact that it's split into 2 minions is probably better than just a single minion because it's far more difficult to deal with. It will take multiple cards to answer both of these minions in most cases. So what you've got here, if this works, is an incredibly strong tempo play. Getting both of those minions on board on turn 3 is ridiculous. It's going to be so hard for opponents to come back from that. It's just a lot of pressure, a lot of trading value, just a big pile of stats. So we know the upside on this card is really, really high. And we know Warlock can play that way too, right? Like, Warlock loves onboard plays via zoo decks. This could fit right into a zoo deck rather nicely. The only challenge for this card, the condition that you have to achieve, is destroying a friendly lackey. So right off, you're limiting yourself to decks that run lackeys, which does hurt the scope of this card a little bit, but lackeys are good cards right now, and that certainly could change in the future. But as far as we know, lackeys are really good, and zoo minion-based Warlock decks already really like running lackeys. They're really good. Evil Genius is a fantastic card for that style of deck. Lackeys themselves work really nicely with things like Magic Carpet in zoo, so it's not like you're making a sacrifice to run your lackeys. And as we've seen with Rogue in the past too, it's not usually that hard to keep a lackey around for an activation either. With things like Heistbear and Togwaggle, they always have lackeys around and they're able to achieve that a vast majority of the time. And I think Warlock will be in the exact same place. This is a card you could maybe hold on to for a turn or two if you have to draw more resources using your hero power until you find that lackey generator. Because even if this comes down on turn 5 or 6 with other stuff, it's still just going to be a big stat dump that's difficult to deal with at pretty much any point in the game with a deck that just keeps applying lots and lots of pressure. So I don't really think this is that much of a restriction. It's definitely going to reduce the consistency of the card in any given game, but the card's still going to work, and there are still going to be those ridiculous high rolls. You can actually still do this on turn 3 with things like the coin. It's a little difficult to do this on turn 3 naturally because you have to generate a lackey and then also play the lackey, so there's some mana committed there in the early turns. But nonetheless, you can still get it out and you can still do some crazy stuff. So I think this is yet again another potentially OP card. And then finally here we have another Warlock card. It's the Riftcleaver, a 6 mana 7/5 demon with a battle cry: destroy a minion. Your hero takes damage equal to its health. So that is basically the text for obliterate, the Death Knight card you would get off of the Lich King back in a previous rotation. But here instead it's attached to a minion, and a pretty meaty boy at that, coming in at a 7/5 stat line. So this card kind of feels like that mid-game removal swing card, almost like Vile Spine Slayer used to feel, where you play a thing and you destroy your opponent's thing. Now, it does come with a noticeable downside compared to Vile Spine Slayer in that you take some damage, but I think historically, Obliterate felt like a good card to play most of the time. You rarely were like, ugh, I just can't play this. Even if you just killed a small health minion along the way, it was still a nice little cheap swing. And with Riftcleaver, it's still going to be a fairly efficient clean kind of trade because you're getting the big minion. So even though you're spending 6 mana, it's really only like the destruction effect is maybe like 1 or 2 mana of the bundle because you're getting a big dude. The question, I guess, for me is like, if you're playing this in a control deck, do they need a tool like this? Would you maybe just rather have a Siphon Soul because you're gonna like Twisting Nether or clear the board later anyway? Does a 7/5 basically add that much value to a control style deck? I do have some questions there. I'm not really sure that it does. I think sometimes the body is a little bit meaningless, and in the reactivity and the flexibility would be far more valuable with something like Obliterate instead. But this doesn't have to exist only in control decks, right? If there's other types of Warlocks out there that play a little faster but can still move towards turn 6, then Riftcleaver could be a very fitting sort of card. I mean, Vile Spine Slayer ran in like Tempo Rogues, right? So could a Zoo toss a Riftcleaver onto the end of their list to just push through a big taunt or make a big swing play, almost like a Fire Elemental a little bit in some faster Shaman decks we've seen? Yeah, I don't see why not. This is like a super Fire Elemental that kills really big stuff and has even more stat line. So even though I do have some questions about where this guy's going to fit into the world of Warlock, I think it's just such a powerful effect, such a big swing, nice stat line on the minion for aggressive decks. All in all, I'm looking at a lot of cool stuff, which means I think this will be a very strong card. So that wraps it up for the detailed reviews. Now let's jump into the quick reviews. Anka the Buried is a 3-star card. Tip the Scales is a 3-star card. Fishflinger is a 2-star card. Bloodsworn Mercenary is a 4-star card. Hunter's Pack is a 4-star card. Evil Recruiter is a 4-star card. Riftcleaver is a 4-star card. And there you go, folks. If you have any thoughts on these cards, of course, I like hearing them. Don't just listen to me. Get lots of opinions on Hearthstone cards. I mean, definitely still listen to me. Watch the videos, obviously. But don't just watch the videos. Read the comments, too, and share your thoughts so we can all learn a little bit down below. But until then, thanks much for watching. And until next time, game on.